We're going to talk about the legality of the traditional Mass. This is our second talk. There are three parts in this conference. We have seen the first one last time, which was a reading of Quo Primum, St. Pius V of July 14, 1570, and a reading of Missale Romanum, the document of Pope Paul VI, promulgating the new Mass 50 years ago, in April 3rd, 1969. And we saw the difference in language. Modernism affects the way one thinks, the way one speaks. It is a crisis. We're living a crisis of authority, and so there will be a crisis as well of legislation, a crisis of law-making. Laws will be ambiguous. Laws will be contradictory. We will speak later on of what Pope Benedict XVI did in 2007, looking back at Quo Primum and Missale Romanum, the document Summorum Pontificum of Pope Benedict is contradictory. It reveals that the old Mass was never suppressed, but after saying what it is, we will look at it a little bit later on. It says that the old Mass is still an exceptional Mass, an extraordinary rite, while it should be, if it was not suppressed, it is the law of the Church. But we'll look at that in a moment. But after this reading of Quo Primum and Missale Romanum, we realize the crisis of authority is very real. We have to go into the expression of this authority. St. Pius V has 11 words, 11 canonical words concerning the law that he is making. It's a law, it's a custom. We will see that today in part 2. Paul VI says in his Missale Romanum document, he says, the goal, he says, it's on paragraph 5, our purpose is to set out, at least in broad terms, the new plan of the Roman Missal. So he's not even going to make a law. He's just saying, well, this is coming up, and now let me just introduce you, prepare you for this new Missal. So, and at the end, he will speak of a law and a promulgation, prescription, but there's actually no laws, which is interesting. But let us, in the second part of this conference, I would like to go over with you this document, which we find on the old website of the District of Asia. So SSPX Asia in one word .com. SSPXasia.com. And if you go to the newsletter section, go to the newsletter of September 1997. So I would like to go over this because if we're going to talk about the legality of the traditional Mass, there's obviously some legal notions we must have. Because we talk about legality, well, there's law, but there's different types of laws, and there's different types of elements in the Church that can be binding, like a custom can be binding, a privilege can be binding. So, in the introduction of this article, The Legal Status of the Traditional Latin Mass, we make reference in the second line to the indult of October 3rd, 1984. That is part of the problem, is that, so the new Mass came in 1969. In 1984, they allowed for the traditional Mass under certain conditions, which basically are, you must accept Vatican II and accept the new Mass. If you accept these two things, you may have the old Mass. And there's a number of letters that came out of Rome, usually from the Commission Ecclesia Dei after 1988, because it was created in 1988. But the Commission Ecclesia Dei repeatedly stated that the traditional Mass had been abrogated when the new Mass came in 1969. Abrogated, we will see the word, which would means done with, removed, forbidden. But this is totally false, and now we have Pope Benedict, who did say in Summorum Pontificum in 2007, he used the word, he calls it the Mass of John the 23rd, which, by the way, he says it in a clause, by the way, was numquam abrogata. They're the words in Latin, was never abrogated. So Pope Benedict XVI contradicted the common practice of the Vatican between 1969 and 2007, almost 40 years, 38 years, that the authorities in the Vatican literally lied on the legal status of the traditional Mass. So we need to understand some notions, and that will be the first part of this text, the notions of law, of custom, and of privilege. There are three words you need to understand, and we will use them in our demonstration. And then we will, in the second part, we will have a thesis, that's how we study in the seminary. We have a statement, and then we will analyze the various parts of the statement. We'll explain that. And of course, all the canons that we use here are the 1917 canon, which was in vigor in 1969. When the new Mass came in 1969, the canon law was 1917. So we cannot use the 1983 canon law when we speak of the new Mass of 1969, because it came up later on. As I told you last week, St. Pius X, the little reminder here, St. Pius X, after describing modernism in the encyclical Pascendi, says the first step to overcome, to fight modernism is scholastic philosophy, is the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. That's the first step. And we will see in this article, we follow this, which in fact is, if we bring a word, we will explain the word, explain the different meanings of the word, we will give a definition of the word, and then we will apply it into a sense that we want. Vatican II, on the contrary, or Vatican II, yes, contrary to Pascendi, Vatican II abolished St. Thomas. They explicitly said it's a pastoral council. We do not want to have technical definitions, to use the technical vocabulary and scholastic method to talk about these things. It is a pastoral council. That was one of the intervention of Archbishop Lefebvre, if I'm not mistaken, in November 1962. And he was rejected, said, no, we don't want these distinctions, these clarification, these definition. This is a pastoral council. Let's not be technical. And through that expression, well, they put away St. Thomas Aquinas, and confusion came in. Confusion and also time bombs, a lot of time bombs. And so let us speak clearly as the Church has always spoke clearly, particularly in the Code of Canon Law. When we speak about the Code of Canon Law of 1917, you need to know that the mind behind this Code of Canon Law, although it was published in 1917, the mind was St. Pius X. It was one of the first reform that he did. He launched it on March 19, 1904, which was to have a Code of Canon Law. There was not a one-volume book of canon law before. It was scattered in so many documents. And so St. Pius X said, no, we need to do some work here. And he's the one who initiated this work, this reform of church law, which took 13 years. He died in 1914 after 10 years. And it is his successor, Pope Benedict XV, who published it in 1970. But Pope Benedict admitted, he says, I didn't do this work, I just put the seal on the work, but the work was done under St. Pius X. Well, he was not yet canonized, but under St. Pius X. So, a few notions. I will not be too long. This is not a course of canon law, but we need to look at some notions and then apply this to the Mass. So, first of all, first part, important notions. What is a law? A law is an ordinance of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. Every element of this definition is essential to any law. An ordinance of reason, if a law is made out of passion, it can happen in a family. The father makes a law when he's in a fit of anger. Well, that's not an ordinance of reason. He's not reasonable. So it's an ordinance of reason for the common good. For the common good, so the good of society, the good of the society for which the law is made. That's why abortion, a law promoting abortion, goes against the very nature of law. Because abortion is not for the common good, such as neither is divorce. So, an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has care of the community. So the authority overseeing that group, whether it's a symphonic orchestra, a village, a nation, or the Catholic Church, it's the head of that society. But it's not enough to have a good law for the common good done by the one who has the authority. If that law remains in the drawer, nobody's going to follow the law. So the law must be promulgated. And a law that is not promulgated is not a law, because nobody knows about it. So the promulgation is the official publication of a law, which makes it possible for the subject of the law to learn of it. The promulgation is necessary for the law to obtain its force. We saw in St. Pius X, St. Pius V, how he promulgated the missal, which he revised, he restored rather than revised, restored according to the wish of the Council of Trent, the order of the Council of Trent. And he gave full force of law to that missal. So he promulgated. And we saw, I mentioned it, when Paul VI issued Missale Romanum, when the text came out for the first time, they had forgotten the promulgation, the date. When will this new Mass be legal? When does it come into law or into practice? So, these are just basic notions. The third point, there are laws that are general and there are laws that are particular. Canon 13, paragraph 1. All those for whom general laws are made are bound by them everywhere. So if it's a general law for all Catholics, so no matter where you are, even if you go into a Muslim country, you go in the middle of the desert, as long as you're a Catholic, you're bound by this law. So a general law is one that is not limited to a particular territory. It is a universal law of the Church. While these general and universal laws bind everywhere, they do not always bind every individual Catholics, but only those for whom they are made. There are laws, for example, for priests. All the priests around the world have to say your breviary every day. That's a universal law, but only for a group of people in the Catholic Church. So wherever we are in the world, we have to say our breviary. A particular law is one which is made for a particular territory or for certain persons. For example, St. Patrick's Day, March 17, is a holiday of obligation in Ireland and in Australia. You have there are certain laws for the army, for example, the ordinariate of the army. Particular laws in a territory. Now, fourth point, the cessation of the law. When does the law cease? This is very important here. Little a. A law can be abrogated, so it can cease by abrogation. If a law is abrogated, the new legislation must say so specifically and clearly. Like the new law must use the word, we abrogate, we eliminate, the old law ceases to have any value. So the word abrogation is important. And Benedict XVI, in 2007, he said the old Mass was not abrogated. He said it. Because it's a technical word. And that is, on the contrary, that is what the Commission Ecclesia Dei has said repeatedly from 1988 until 2007 in many documents. Well, yeah, the old Mass was suppressed or abrogated with the new Mass in 1969, and that was not true. Because you can read again Missale Romanum of Paul VI, he does not use the word abrogation. You have the word derogation, which means that the previous legislation remains in force but is modified in some ways. In other words, it is a partial abrogation. The legislator will change one clause of the previous law. Because we'll see, like Quo Primum. Quo Primum says many things. One of the things it said was every Catholic, every of the Roman Rite must follow the Mass for the people, for the priest must say this Mass according to this missal and no other way unless it's more than 200 years old. Paul VI will say, I make an exception to that. Now there will be a new way to have Mass. So Paul VI will be a derogation. But he will not suppress the old law. He will just change one clause of the old law. Pius V said, nobody can say Mass in any other way. Paul VI says, no, you can continue to say this Mass, but now you can also say Mass this way. That's called a derogation. And C, abrogation, that is the substitution of a new legislation which automatically replaces the previous legislation without any specific words of abrogation. So if it's clearly contrary or it matches the old law and replaces all the aspects of the previous law, well, we call that an abrogation. It is an implicit abrogation. It's technical, but as long as you have some notions, that's all we need to know at this moment. D, we need to know this Canon 22 of the Old Code of Canon Law, which deals with doubtful suppression of a law. If it's not clear what the new law says, but there's a rule, if a new law is not clear, the old law remains. That's the one principle. If the latter law, so if the new law is equally general for the whole church, or equally particular, all the Irish people, with the former one, then the new law will repeal the former one in only 3 cases. If it contains an explicit statement to that effect, a repealing clause, as we say, it's abrogation. From now on, for example, I'm just thinking of a possible abrogation. In Ireland, St. Patrick's Day will no longer be a day of obligation. That would be an explicit statement. It repeals it. 2, if it is directly contrary to the former law, so that it is evidently impossible for the two to stand together. And 3, if it deals with the entire subject matter of the former law. So, this is a way to suppress a previous law. In all other cases, or if the matter is doubtful, that's Canon 23, the 2 laws stand together and are to be reconciled as far as possible. It's a little bit technical, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is a church law, which we will use later on. Second point, if the latter law, so the new law, is particular, like we make a law for Ireland, and the former law is general for the whole church, well, in Ireland, in this case, the new law will prevail for this particular country or these particular people. Okay? And third point, if the new law is general, but there is an old law which is for a particular group of people, it has to be said expressly in the new law. That's what St. Pius V said. Some people may claim they got a privilege, they got an exception, we've had it for hundreds of years. St. Pius V says, I remove every particular laws, every other manner of saying Mass that may exist, and he goes by name as much as possible. So he revocates the old law. In Canon 23, whenever there's a doubtful revocation of a law, in doubt, the revocation is not presumed, but we try to conciliate the 2 laws. then the reason is common good, for the sake of common good. In other words, St. Pius V, let's apply this to our case. If St. Pius V said, everybody in the Catholic Church, in the Latin Rite, must use this missal, Paul VI says, I'm bringing out a new missal that may be used. The two are compatible. I'm speaking only of legal, canonical things. Strictly speaking, theoretically speaking, we could have, and there are in the church, different rites to say Mass. Pius V himself says, if you can prove that your rite is more than 200 years old, fine. You can keep the old rite or take dismissal. And Paul VI said the same thing. So if they can go together, well, we leave them together. So these are just a few notions about law. The law must be very clear, and if you suppress a law, the suppression must say clearly what it suppresses, and if it's not clear, the old law remains. Just remember that part. Another element we need to understand is the element of custom. Because they say custom is the best interpreter of laws. A custom may be considered in two ways, as a fact or as a legal norm. As a fact, a custom means a practice or way of acting which is common in a certain community. This way of doing it, the way of the positions at Mass. You go to different countries, you have different customs. You have some countries where they kneel during the whole Mass. You have countries that sit part and stand part and kneel part. So there are different customs. Different customs on processions as well and things like that. As a legal norm, a custom is a kind of law after so many years, like with prescription. It is an unwritten law founded upon the common practice in the community and approved by the superior. There was never a law saying so, but everybody's doing it for many, many years. The superior, the bishop knows, and without having to say, we're going to do it like this, we just keep the custom. No problem. We'll keep that way of doing things. So, notion of customs and suppression of customs. Canon 30. Oh, it's very technical. Okay. I'm going to summarize. But it's a bit like the laws. It has to be clearly said. There's general custom, particular customs. There's or a custom may cease to exist by neglect, and so on. But what you need to understand is a general custom, a custom for the universal church, will be removed by a new law only if it is explicitly said. If you look at section C, the second and third point. For a general law to remove a particular custom, let's look at number 1 first. A general law removes a general custom, a particular law, a particular custom, when they are contrary to each other, even if there's no mention of them. I'm in section cessation of the law, little c and II. For a general law to remove a particular custom, it is necessary that it expresses this custom by name, or that it has a clause such as notwithstanding any custom whatsoever. II, to remove a centenary custom, that's a particular kind of custom. If it's more than 100 years old, or we say immemorial, we don't know when it started. There's things at Mass that we do which go back to apostolic times, but there is no written law that when it started, it was just a custom. To remove a centenary custom, a particular clause is required, notwithstanding any custom whatsoever, even centenary and immemorial. And if that is not there, the old custom remains. And again, if it's not clear, if a new custom is not totally opposed to an old custom, if they can be reconciled, they stay together. So, we've seen the notion of law, the notion of custom, which is a practice that is being followed. Some of them are lost in time, in a sense. We don't know when it started. It's been like this always. And now there's a third element we need to understand, is the notion of privilege. A privilege is a particular right. Canon 63, a privilege is a special disposition lawfully made by the competent authority, granting to some person or persons a right which is contrary to or beyond the common law. A privilege, for example, to eat meat on Friday. And in Spain, they have that privilege. In Spain, they can eat meat on Friday, because Spain has been so generous with the discovery of the New World. They gave so much to Rome that in order to thank them, well, Rome says, okay, we give you that. If you want, you can eat, you can abstain from meat, but it's not a sin if you don't eat meat on Friday. That's a privilege for a particular country. Privilege can cease in 5 different ways, and you have it here. But what you need to remember basically is it has to be mentioned. It has normally a privilege, especially if a privilege is still active. In order to remove the privilege, it needs to be mentioned by the competent superior. A privilege is regarded as perpetual unless the contrary appears. So we have these 3 notions: law, custom, privilege. The traditional Mass, is that what we're going to try to prove right now, leans on these 3 foundations, and it's not enough to remove one. In order to abolish Quo Primum, a pope would have to abolish all 3 foundations. Otherwise, the right to say the traditional Mass remains on either of the 3. But you will see, especially when we speak about privilege, it's something really providential that St. Pius V mentioned that. Let me just read through the thesis, and then we'll have a brief explanation. So here's the thesis. This is presented here in a seminary fashion, in a scholastic fashion. There's a major premise. The traditional Mass in the Tridentine Rite is, number 1, a general law. It's clear in the Bull Quo Primum. Number 2, a perpetual privilege. St. Pius V said, you must do this, and also he said, you may do this. He used the different words. And 3 is a centenary and immemorial custom. So that is what Quo Primum is, and the traditional Mass. The first minor, now to be abolished, all these 3 legal grounds must be abolished together. That's canon law. We said each one is solid enough to justify the validity and the licity, the lawfulness of the traditional Mass. Second minor, Now, Paul VI, with the Constitution Missale Romanum of April 3rd, 1969, did not abolish any of the three legal grounds. You have the text in your hand. You can look at that. We will prove that in a moment. But he does not mention these things. What did he do? B, he merely derogated to the prohibition to offer the Holy Mass in any other way than imposed by St. Pius V. St. Pius V says everybody must say Mass this way. Paul VI says, yeah, but I allow an exception. I give permission to say Mass in another way without removing the law. That's exactly what Paul VI did. We're not looking at whether it's good or bad. That's not the point here. The point is, legally speaking, what did he do? That's all he did. He brought in an exception, which is called a derogation. Conclusion, therefore, the traditional Mass in the Latin Tridentine Rite is perfectly legal. Pope Paul VI did not abolish it. B, the Constitution Missale Romanum merely derogated to Quo Primum by promulgating a new rite of Mass. So that's the canonical thesis. And now we prove the points that need to be proven a little bit. The major, that it is a law, a privilege, and a custom. We have it here. Proof of the major. First of all, it is a general law. We find this in Quo Primum. We specifically command, so it's pretty clear, each and every patriarch, administrator, and all other persons of whatsoever ecclesiastical dignity, be they cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, or possessed of any other rank of preeminence, and we order them by virtue of holy obedience, that's clear. He's using his full authority to sing or to read the Mass according to the rite and manner and norm herein laid down by us, and henceforward to discontinue and utterly discard all other rubrics and rites of other missals, however ancient, which they have been accustomed to follow. Oh, in our place, in our country, in our region, in our province, we do things differently. Pius V says, I don't care. From now on, you're going to do it this way. And not to presume in celebrating Mass to introduce any ceremonies or recite any prayers other than those contained in this missal. So this is where Paul VI will bring in a change. He says, well, I'm making an exception here. I'm changing this clause. Consequently, says Pius V, it is our will, and by the same authority we decree, and here's the promulgation of the law, that 1 month after publication of this our Constitution and Missal, priests of the Roman Curia shall be obliged to sing or to read the Mass in accordance therewith, others south of the Alps after 3 months, those who live beyond the Alps after 6 months, or as soon as the Missal becomes available for purchase. It's a clear law. You must use this Missal. We, the authority in the church, order you, command you. Okay? One could have said, well, it does not say when. I said, yeah, I'm telling you when. Those in Rome, 30 days. Those beyond the Alps, north of Italy, 3 months. Those beyond the Alps, 6 months. If you're in Ireland or Scotland, well, whenever you get a missal. The moment you start getting missals, you're obliged to say this Mass. So, that's a law. The Quo Primum also grants a privilege. And this is very providential. Let's read. Furthermore, okay, so he's adding a ground, another pillar to support this missal. By these presents and by virtue of our apostolic authority, so he's in charge, we give and grant in perpetuity that for the singing or reading of Mass in any church whatsoever, so forever, this missal may be followed absolutely. It's very interesting. First, he said, you must follow this missal. Now he says, you may follow this missal. Do you see the nuance? And these are canonical words. And Archbishop Lefebvre referred to this in 1976. 1976, he says, I'm being forbidden to ordain priests because they will say this traditional Mass. Well, St. Pius V said, every priest may say this Mass. So Archbishop Lefebvre claimed this privilege without any scruple of conscience or fear of incurring any penalty, judgment, or censure, and may be freely and lawfully used. And then he says, nobody in the church will be obliged to celebrate Mass otherwise than enjoined by us. All these laws, the bishops, even Paul VI, the cardinals, the bishops said, you must say the new Mass. I'm sorry. Pius V said, nobody can force me to say Mass other than this way. And I cannot be punished if I say Mass according to Quo Primum, the Missal of Pius V. So, notice that paragraph. The first part, everybody, every priest may follow this Missal. Second point, nobody can be obliged to celebrate Mass in another way. And thirdly, whoever shall be forced or coerced into altering this Missal. Nobody can be forced to change this Missal. And this constitution will remain forever. You see how? I continue. This present constitution can never be revoked or modified, or shall forever remain valid and have the force of law, notwithstanding previous constitutions or edicts of provincial or synodal councils, and notwithstanding the uses. Use here means the customs, the practice of churches aforesaid, he mentioned above, established by very long and even immemorial prescription. Oh, we have always done like this here for centuries. Pius V says, I'm sorry, unless you have more than 200 years and you can prove it to me, your privilege is abolished. You must say Mass this way. And thirdly, so the Mass is a law. Quo Primum is a law for the Universal Church, is a privilege. But Pius V, at the beginning of Quo Primum, proves that what he did was the universal custom in the church. At the beginning of Quo Primum, he explains what he did. We resolve accordingly to delegate this task of restoring the Missal to a select committee of scholars, and they, having gone through all the monasteries, look at the manuscripts, and that's what they have done here. They have restored the Missal to the pristine form and rite of the Holy Fathers. So, Quo Primum makes a law. It's the first time, this is 1570, it's the first time a pope makes a universal law about the way of saying Mass. Until then, there were either privileges or customs, mostly customs. So Pius V acknowledges and grants a privilege, and he acknowledges that this custom, the way he restored the Mass, is according to the rite of form and rite of the Holy Fathers. Okay, so we continue. Well, we go back to page 4. We have, so we now have explained the major, the principle. Now the first minor says, in order to be abolished, all these three legal grounds must be abolished together. And go to page 5. Proof of the first minor. Well, that's the result of the notions we have mentioned in the first part. Canon law says for general law to be abrogated, it must be said specifically. For privilege, it must be said specifically. For custom, it must be said specifically. And one legal ground is sufficient for the legality of the traditional mass. So what was this? The second minor, go back to page 4. The second minor, what did Paul VI do? A, he did not abolish any of the three grounds. B, he simply derogated. He gave a permission. Okay, go back to page 5. The bottom of page 5. Paul VI, what did he do? Last paragraph of page 5. It is our will that these decisions and ordinances, in the translation I have here, that I have given you, which I got online, they say laws and prescriptions. Okay. So these are Latin expressions. Should be firm and effective now and in the future, notwithstanding any constitution and apostolic ordinances made by predecessors, and all other decrees, including those deserving a special mention, no matter of what kind. That seems pretty strong, but it's actually just the envelope. It does not abrogate previous. It has a certain appearance, but it doesn't go into detail as it ought to do for to abolish Quo Primum. So, page 6, it did not abrogate Quo Primum. Paul VI says it is our will that these decisions and ordinance or laws and prescription, well, nowhere in the Missale Romanum it is decided and ordered that Quo Primum itself or the general law promulgated by it have been abrogated. And Pope Benedict XVI confirmed this. He says it was never abrogated. Second point, it did not suppress the perpetual privilege. The word privilege is not in the document of Paul VI. Therefore, according to Canon 70, a privilege is regarded perpetual unless the contrary appears. So if Paul VI did not mention privilege, well then, the privilege of saying the traditional Mass is maintained. Even if there are other ways of saying Mass, but this way of saying Mass, this Mass may be followed. And third, it did not suppress the centenary and immemorial custom. The clause necessary to suppress a centenary and immemorial custom, the clause is, notwithstanding any custom whatsoever, even centenary and immemorial is not to be found in Missale Romanum. And that's legal. If it's not there, I'm sorry, it's not suppressed. So what did Paul VI do? He merely derogated, so he made an exception to the prohibition of to offer Mass in any other way than imposed by St. Pius V. As we saw above, St. Pius V forbade the use of any other missal younger than 200 years for the reading and singing of Mass, and Paul VI derogated to this prohibition. And he had the power to do so. It does not mean it was right or wrong, but he had the power to do so. And it does not mean that Mass is good. We're just looking at, did he have the papal right to do so? The answer is yes. Conclusion. So, if one disputes this conclusion, and over the last 50 years, many people in the US, if somebody said, I give $10,000 to anybody who shows me a papal document suppressing Quo Primum, the guy still has his money, or he spent it on something else. And so there's no pope who abrogated Quo Primum as a law, as a custom, as a privilege. And if there were a doubt, if it's not sure, because a lot of even modern canonists say, well, it has been, well, it's not clear, well, then Canon 23. In doubt, the revocation of the former law is not presumed, but later laws are to be considered in connection with earlier ones, and as far as possible to be reconciled with them. So, in summary, the right to say the traditional Mass according to the Tridentine rite. Tridentine comes from Trent, the city of Trent. The right to say this Mass is based on a law, a general law for the Universal Church of the Latin Rite, a privilege, and a custom. Paul VI did not suppress any of these three. He simply allowed another manner of saying Mass. And here's the crisis in the church. But that was so subtle, and the campaign around the new Mass was so well orchestrated that the impression worldwide was spread that the new Mass was replacing the old Mass. And that the new Mass was a law as strong, canonically speaking, as Quo Primum. That is why when you read Missale Romanum again, a number of times in Missale Romanum, he makes reference to St. Pius V. But that's sad to say, it's only a little bit powder thrown at your eyes. Oh, Pius V, we're doing like him. But where? He doesn't. He's just making an exception to Pius V. Okay? And so, Pope Benedict in 2007, he confirmed this study, he confirmed these notions, which are based on the Old Code of Canon Law. He said the Old Mass was never abrogated. Numquam abrogata. Now, we said at the beginning that at Vatican II, they wanted to remove St. Thomas Aquinas. And the scholastic, the clear manner of thinking, of speaking, of tradition, of which is uses the tools of philosophy. So follow me, okay? I will show you the contradiction in the document of Benedict XVI. So I have proven to you through this canonical study that the Old Mass in 1969 was still the law of the Church, the universal law of the Church. Paul VI only made an exception. You may say Mass in this way. Okay? Pope Benedict XVI said he acknowledges the fact that the Old Mass was not abrogated. So, first, that statement is true. But then, Benedict XVI says, he calls the new Mass the ordinary rite, and the Old Mass the extraordinary rite. Which means, in canonical language, that the new Mass is the universal law of the Church, and the Old Mass the exception. So, in the same document, but the reality is the other way around. The Old Mass is the law, the new Mass is the exception.
Is he allowed to do it?
But is he allowed to do this? The question, the point is, the modernist thinking is open to contradiction. On one hand, he says the traditional Mass was never abrogated, which means it is still the universal law of the Church. It should be said in every church in the world. And the new Mass should be the exception. Priests who want to say it, well, if you want to say it. But on Sunday, we're going to say the Old Mass. But then he goes on, because of the practice of 40 years, 1969 to 2007, the practice has spread the new Mass everywhere. So he said, well, the new Mass is really the common Mass, so he called it the ordinary Mass. And the Old Mass is the exception. So to call the Old Mass the extraordinary rite is a contradiction. It is the ordinary, the Mass that should be said. So, that's the end of part 2.
What's about St. Pius V say?
What page are you?
On page 5.
Page 5.
Page 5.
Which paragraph?
No one shall be forced or coerced into altering this missal.
Yes.
What's about the Good Friday prayers by?
So, okay, the question is, St. Pius V says no one can be forced or coerced into altering this missal. These words means I cannot force you to use prayers other than those in this missal. So, if the Vatican comes out with a new prayer, say for Good Friday, that will also be a derogation. We're looking at it canonically. I'm not saying if it's good or bad. It would be a kind of... So, you may say prayers in another way, but you can also continue to say the old way. Get it? And see, that's where one has to be clear. And thanks be to God, St. Pius V was a Dominican, and he knew well St. Thomas. So he's clear. And that's why the Novus Ordo is confused, and they try to get in through the confusion. You must, Pius V said, no, I'm not obliged to. I can use the old way. And even those of the Ecclesia Dei groups who take the reforms of Good Friday prayers about the Jews and things like this, we have to obey. Actually, they're not... They should not be even obliged in conscience, because St. Pius V said, no, you can stick to these prayers. So, okay, let's go to part 3.